creeps, and welcome back to Horror History. Can you guys believe that next week is Halloween? And that kind of freaks me out and that kind of bums me out, but I'm calming myself down because today we are talking about my very favorite horror legend, Dracula. Now, before we get ahead of ourselves, go ahead and slap that like button like you were driving a wooden stake for a vampire's heart. Dracula is one of the most romantic horror stories. I mean, in fact, you could absolutely argue that it gave birth to the romantic goth genre. However, to Bram Stoker, this was not a tale of fiction. This was a true story of evil. So during the course of this episode, I'm going to do my very best to separate fact from fiction and to learn why one of my favorite serial killers is to blame for this book being labeled fiction in the first place. But before that, let's go ahead and drain the life out of some spook tales. This, my friends, this is the Vampire's Kiss Martini. It's delicious. It is kind of sinful. It's got a bite. Let's have a sip, and I'm gonna see if I can. Delicious. Now I am going to remove my fangs, step back into my mortal body, have some more of my spook tale, and get on with the show. Ching ching creeps. So we all know Dracula is the love child of Irish author Bram Stoker, which is one of the coolest names ever. Little is known about why he believed his book to be real until now. Now listen, if you've ever read the book, you know the book isn't written in typical novel fashion. Instead, it's a compilation of journal entries from different characters, ship logs, even phonograph recordings. But did you know that the book everybody knows and has read actually starts on page 102? That's right. There was 101 different pages that we have never seen that was in the original Dracula. And the reason why they're not there is because in 1897, when he brought it to his UK publisher, his publisher was like, hey, there's this guy who's like slicing up all of these prostitutes, and we really don't want Londoners to be even like more terrified than they already are. So nix the first 101 pages, change your preface, and we're going to release it as fiction or not at all. That's crazy, right? Jack the Ripper's little slice him up tour of London is the reason why Stoker had to release his book as fiction. It blows my mind. I think it's so absolutely fascinating. So our goal is to try to figure out through some sleuthing what was in those 101 pages and what was real about them. We need to start with the beginning, like I love to do. We have to go back to Dublin when little baby Bram Stoker is born, and he's a sickly little boy, just like Robert Louis Stevenson, actually. For the first 7 years of his life, he is bedridden. He's not doing anything. He's not going anywhere. He's just in his bed from an unknown illness. We don't even know what he had. But during these 7 years in bed, his mother, Charlotte, filled his time with beautiful stories, little cute fairy tales that she'd tuck her son in at night, talking about her time growing up in her little Northern Ireland town where there was a really intense cholera outbreak. And you know what was common during this cholera outbreak in this town she lived in? Burying people when they weren't actually dead. Not great. This was actually something that was kind of common in the Victorian era, which is why there's some coffins that have a bell in it, or like the glass, just in case you can be like, hey, I'm not dead. But she personally had heard stories, seen stories, these things happen in her town. So she would tell her little son, like, hey, honey, there was this girl who woke up in a mass grave because she wasn't dead. And there was another woman that woke up in a morgue, but then she did die because of fright or something. And then, oh yeah, there was that other guy that didn't actually have cholera. And turns out he wasn't actually dead, just in an opium stupor. And he woke up when they were taking a sledgehammer to his legs to make him fit in the coffin. I feel like it's pretty easy to see here how this might have set a foundation for Stoker's obsession with people rising from the grave, or the idea of the undead. And this is an obsession he will carry with the rest of his life. So he gets better from whatever illness this was. He ends up going on to Trinity College. He studies mathematics. He then follows in his father's footsteps and becomes a civil servant at the Dublin Castle, working for the royal family. And he's there for like 10 years. And at some point, maybe he just realized he was good at telling stories. I think he was, maybe writing some little bits and bobs. He moves to London and ends up getting a job at the Lyceum Theatre, like doing reviews, but also he's like the assistant to the actor Henry Irving, who I think at one point becomes Sir Henry Irving. But it's there that he really starts to develop his passion for the written word. And also working for this beautiful theater, he got to travel with the show, which at one point brought him to America, where he learned about the New England vampire panic. I'm just elated to be able to talk about the New England vampire panic. So if you don't know what it is, let's talk about it. So basically, honestly, it lasted for like the better part of 100 years, but it really hit its peak in the 1890s. And so essentially, you have this horrible tuberculosis outbreak that lasts, like it's all over New England, it's in Rhode Island, or consumption as they called it then, because of the way it consumes the body. It's spreading like wildfire. It's the 1890s, we're in a pretty rural place. And when a lot of people start dying, these people who were very religious started coming with some really crazy ideas. So I'll walk you through it. Imagine you are very religious, you are superstitiously religious, and this horrible disease, this evil disease starts to take over people in your town. But why is it spreading? Well, I know it's because the dead are really undead and they're waking from their graves to go and feast on the living, naturally. Such as the infamous case of Mercy Brown, who was this 19-year-old girl. I think her mother had TB and died. She gets TB and she dies. It's winter. They put her body in like a little above ground, like cold storage, just call it that. And then her brother gets sick. And it's at this point where the townspeople and the father are like, I don't want to spread a rumor. I don't want to spread rumors, guys, but I think Mercy might be waking from the grave every night and coming to feast on the soul of her brother. I mean, I don't want to throw out conclusions, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. And the townspeople and the father and everybody's like, yes, I think she's probably a vampire. This sounds absolutely like that. There's no other reason for this. So here's how we do it. Let's go exhume her grave or her body. Let's go to the little cold storage meat lager. Now that was English. It's fine. And we'll see what state her body's in. If she's starting to decompose, she's dead. If she's looking fresh, vampire. So they go, they see her body. She's looking rosy as hell. And they're like, that's it, proof of it's a vampire. And there's a lot of interesting things that can happen if you have now apparently definitely been deemed vampire. It's kind of like a buffet, like choose what you want. Like, oh, here we go. Here's on this platter, you can take this corpse and, just keep it simple. We'll, cut out the heart and some of the other organs. Let's burn them, mash up the ashes, put them in a little mixture and have the inflicted person drink it, cured, done. Actually, sometimes we don't need to drink it. You could just, mash up the heart and let the smoke from it, inhale it, and, kind of like Sanderson's sister style. Breathe in the life or the cure or the whatever, get your soul back. Or you could just eat it. Or you could just decapitate the body and like move the head to the feet. Go ahead and chop up the body and move it about in bits in the coffin, because then it surely can't walk. Vampire New England panic. This happened to at least 29 corpses. And newsflash, the brother definitely died of tuberculosis. So didn't work. However, it's easy to think this is nuts and poke fun, but honestly, this is a ritual that is still carried out in parts of Eastern Europe today. People truthfully believe this, and in a time where we didn't have modern science, really. A lot was still not known. And these were rural areas where you could safely assume a lot of people weren't educated. You kind of can't blame them for worrying that, it's evil. Now, this is where we can kind of start stitching together the truth of Stoker's Dracula, because we know he was fascinated by this event because he carried around articles and news clippings of this event. And that's pretty much how we've gotten all of our information, is through Stoker's various journals and notes that he took over the years in preparation for this novel. And what I find most interesting is it's almost as if he kind of believes it. And I'm not sure if he believes vampires were real in this sense of New England vampire panic. Like, did he think they had consumption and these people were crazy? Or did he actually think they were actually rising from the grave, even if they weren't vampires, because he grew up hearing stories of that happening all the time in his mother's town? So you really have to wonder, what was it that he believed? What was it that he was so fascinated by? But what is very clear is he thought it was at least probable. It's also from his notes that we know he was greatly inspired by the book The Land Beyond the Forest, which is where Nosferatu, the Transylvanian legend of this undead creature that drinks the blood of the living, is first introduced. It is also through the British Library's logs that we know the books he checked out, and they have his journals. So you can kind of compare these logs to, like, he checked out this book on this day, one of them being the complete history of Wallachia and Moldavia, which is like very random. Like, the library apparently didn't even know that they had that book. And it had all of these different legends from that region. And then we also have traced him to like the Whitby Museum, where he checked out a bunch of maps where he traced like a path from London to a remote castle in Transylvania, Romania. He never went to Romania, though. This is what I find fascinating. He never actually traveled to this place that he wrote about so beautifully. But the reason why he wrote about it so beautifully and could depict it so accurately is because he studied it like a mofo. Like, this guy was absolutely obsessed with Eastern European legends, blood-sucking vampires, or vampire as they called it in their language. I don't know. I don't even know if it's Wallachian or Wallachian, okay? It's probably Wallachian. That's neither here nor there. But anyways, speaking of Wallachian or Wallachian, the name Dracula, that, my friends, is an old Wallachian word that means devil. So what about the shape-shifting and the bats? Well, again, from his notes, I'm not going to keep reiterating it, okay? Let's just accept the fact that through his notes in his journals, this is how we get a lot of this information. That's how we're piecing together the fabric of the truth versus fiction here. We know because he had a lot of newspaper articles on it, about Darwin's exploration and discovery of vampire bats in Southern America. And so I think it's very clear to see that in his own narrative, he found a way to morph this legend of Dracula and this vampire bat. But there's more to the shape-shifting, and this is one of my favorite real-life events that he took inspiration from for Dracula. So you know how in the book, there's that giant black dog that leaps from the ship called the Demeter that runs ashore in England. Well, in real life, there was a vessel that came from Varna, which was an eastern seaport. It kind of ran aground in England, in Whitby. This happened a few years before Bram actually wrote Dracula. But however, or whenever he ended up hearing about it, he actually traveled to Whitby, went and talked to the Royal Navy Guardsmen people to ask about this ship, the Dimitri. It's so fascinating to me. So this real ship, the Dimitri, carried with it the same strange cargo as in the book, which is crates and crates of earth. And when the ship finally got to shore or ran aground or whatever happened there, a lot of the crew was dead or very sickly, And when it got there, a giant black dog that was resemblance of, I think it called a Burgast or a Burgast or whatever, like this legendary scary dog thing, leaps from the ship and runs up towards this church on the hill. So if you've read the novel or seen the shows or watched the movies, you know that on the Demeter, that is how Dracula gets from Romania to England, is on a ship that he has filled with crates of earth. And during this voyage, he ends up feasting on the crew, so much so that when they get to port, he finally escapes the ship as a dog. Like, we're not even reaching here, folks. Like, this is actually something that happened. But there's also technical things like blood transfusions. So if you've read the book, again, you know that the character Lucy continuously is getting blood transfusions from the men that she loves, including Van Helsing, or the men that love her, in order to save her, because they don't really realize, except Van Helsing has an idea, that she's turning into a vampire. And I think that replenishing her blood will help, despite the fact that they weren't blood testing, and she could have probably freaking died from the wrong blood type, but who cares, who knows, doesn't matter. This was a very technical thing. And yes, this is 1897. Blood transfusions have been around since roughly 1795, but still fairly new. And Stoker wanted to get it right. So he asked his brother, who's a medicine man, how to properly do a blood transfusion. So there's these really beautiful notes from his brother on how to properly do a blood transfusion. And I just love that element of realism, which just continues our mission on finding why it was so important for him to tell this story correctly, because clearly the dude's believing a lot of it. But I think we need to look deeper in Stoker's actual personal life to get the rest of our truths of this story. I mean, at its core, no matter how you spin it, this is a very cut and dry story of good versus evil. You have the Count, who is, by all accounts for this book, the devil. And then you have, this lustful group of female vampires that seek to, seduce Harker, who's this very gentlemanly, pious man. And even though he's engaged to this virginal Mina back in London, he can't help but fall prey to the lusty wantonness of these female vampires. I mean, it's absolutely playing into that that very Christian idea of females being these kind of sinful sexual creatures that men are always falling prey to and being victim of. And you also have to keep in mind that this is the Victorian age. And in the Victorian age, women are allowed to be two things. You get to be a pious lady or a whore, but you don't get to be both. You cannot be, God forbid, you are a virgin, and then you decide, hey, I like sex. Oh, nope. You are either a lady or a whore. You cannot be both. And he demonstrates this in the book when Lucy is turning into a vampire. All of these men are fawning over her. She's beautiful. We love her. Oh, I want to marry her. No, I want to marry her. No, I want to marry her. And now she's getting a little liberated because she's had a little bit of the blood. You know what I mean? And they're like, oh my God. Oh my God. Is that a voice? Is she saying what she wants? Is she horny? Nah. Jesus. And despite the fact that Dracula is always surrounded by females, and he's the one that's creating these sexy vampire female women, we're never seeing him in a sexual way, which really solidifies the fact that this book, amongst so many other things, is an allegory for, the sinful nature of sex, which I find so interesting. But there's other themes at play here. We really would be remiss to not talk about the social themes in Dracula. It's not just religious. And what I mean by that is the Count is an aristocrat. He's a rich dude, and he has this lawyer, Harker, come from London all the way to Romania to help him get his affairs in order so he can make this voyage to England, whatever, blah, 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 blah. And along Harker's journey to get to this castle, all of these peasant townspeople are trying to warn him, don't go there, bad, evil crossing, don't do it, bless you, bless you, bless you, don't go to the castle, which is I think, really fascinating, because in Stoker's real life, like, he wasn't a rich guy. He wasn't high society. He grew up middle class. He was a civil servant to the royal family at the castle. And then he lived the life of an artist. The guy never got to see the sensation his book became. Like, he died, you could argue, almost penniless. So I think there's this real overwhelming arc in the book of the richer you are, the higher society you are, the more kind of dangerous you are, the more you feed on the people below you. So you're not just physically draining the life force out of people, you are thematically draining the life force out of people of lower classes than you. And I just think it's a really interesting notion to play with. And I just don't believe in my heart of hearts that it's just a religious thematic novel, or that's why he thinks it's real. I think there's a lot more complicated emotions going into this book than just those things. So the last question we have to ask is, what was in the first 101 pages? What came before the opening scene on the train? Well, we'll never quite know. I mean, even the original manuscript that was found very randomly in the 80s in an attic in Pennsylvania started on page 102, and that was in the Paul Allen collection, and I don't even know where it is now. But we do have a couple clues. The number one clue is a short story that Stoker's widow, Florence, published for him 2 years after his death in 1914, called Dracula's Guest. It's a short story, and from his notes in his journals, he makes reference to Dracula's Guest, and it's like crossed out in bits and bobs, so you can assume that it was crossed out because it was included in the original. So maybe that was the part that his publisher had him take out. It's a great little short story. But essentially, it starts off with this like English gentleman in this carriage riding through Germany. He has like this stagecoach dude who's also an innkeeper who's like driving him across town to this village. And he's all freaked out and he barely speaks any English. And the Englishman notices like this crossing at the road and wants to see what's down one end. And the German dude's like, no, it's Walpurgisnacht, which is like a night that's celebrated in Europe. That is like supposedly when witches are active and the dead rise from the graves. And this Englishman is like, why are you so freaked out about going down this road? And he's like, Walpurgisnacht, no, evil. And through like broken English, he tells him that this village that's down this end of the road, a bunch of people died there, but then they didn't stay dead and they came up from the ground and they were feeding on people, and now it's unholy and anybody could leave left, and all that's left is the living dead, essentially. And this Englishman, for whatever reason, is just like curious, or maybe he doesn't believe him. And he's like, you know what, you go ahead. I want to walk back anyways. Don't worry about me. Have a good night. And the guy's like, no. And he ultimately gets out of the carriage and walks his ass through this deserted forest. It starts snowing. He gets to this creepy village and takes shelter. I'm sure there's buildings, but the building he chooses to take shelter from the snow in is a mausoleum, where he finds a dead woman who doesn't look dead, who awakens, terrifies him. He runs out into the snow. She gets hit by lightning. It all feels very scary. And then out of freaking nowhere, a giant dog, or possibly wolf, comes and like stands over him and protects him. And it's at this point, somebody, this like military dude, comes and saves him and takes him to the inn, where he is informed that his host, who he's on his travels to go meet, a man named Dracula, ordered the people at the inn to go protect him. And that's where it ends. That is the first time Dracula's name is used. And so this guy in the carriage, this Englishman, isn't Harker. So my hypothesis is this was the beginning of the book. It also starts with a journey to Romania, which I guess if I was an author and I had to nix a bunch of pages, I would also start, the revised version on the same kind of journey. But my hypothesis is that the original few hundred pages or 100 pages included maybe multiple different men on their way to meet the Count, possibly to do the same job that Harker goes to do. So maybe Harker is the first time he actually gets to make the voyage, because maybe all the other ones die. We'll never know. But what I find interesting is when Florence actually published this short story, along with a couple other ones actually, her preface for this one was, "This was in the original Dracula that my husband had to have removed. This is very important for him to have this out in the world, so I am doing this for him." Way to go, Florence. The last little clue that we have as to what the book originally was, and to possibly give insight as to what Bram took as real, is in the Icelandic version of Dracula, the original print. Since it was outside the jurisdiction of his UK publisher, he was able to keep his original preface. And I'm going to read you a bit of what it says. I'm going to read it because I don't want to misquote it. So this is what the original preface said. "I am quite convinced that there is no doubt whatever that the events here described really took place. However unbelievable and incomprehensible they might appear at first sight, and I am further convinced that they must always remain to some extent incomprehensible. All the people who have willingly or unwillingly played a part in this remarkable story are known generally and well respected. Both Jonathan Harker and his wife, who is a woman of character, and Dr. Seward are my friends and have been so for many years, and I have never doubted that they were telling the truth." So what a bomb that drops. You have to ask yourself, holy crap. Did he have really imaginative friends that told him this grandiose story, and working the theater and growing up the way he did and having the fascinations that he did that just make his mind go crazy and wild with imagination, and he really thought that he was writing something that was true? Or was it true? We don't know. And then the very last thing is the end of Dracula. The way he kind of ends it is he kind of gets his message in there because he had to change the preface. But the ending is essentially all of these events happened, but all of the original paperwork is gone. Therefore, that is why everything has been typewritten for the book. So where is the truth? I think to Stoker, it kind of all is. I mean, we'll never know exactly why this particular subject felt so important for him to tell, but historical evidence shows us he was deeply compelled to warn us of something. And whether that something is vampires or possibly just the real life effects of superstition, we don't know. We're never going to know. What I can say definitively is, although we all love the idea of Vlad the Impaler, Vlad Dracula having been the inspiration for Dracula, it was not. Despite how much he researched Wallachian history, that it was not the inspiration for Dracula. I mean, I think ultimately what it is a beautiful cautionary tale comprised of many different historical events that he spun into a narrative that literally changed the world. And for vamp fans like myself, if it wasn't for Bram Stoker, we wouldn't have the Anne Rice Vampire Chronicles. We wouldn't have Stephenie Meyer. What would all those people do without freaking Twilight? We wouldn't have True Blood. We wouldn't have one of my favorite movies of all time, Only Lovers Left Alive. And we wouldn't have the badass soundtrack from Queen of the Damned. I mean, vampires are a never-ending source of imagination for people because it plays on immortality, it plays on sensuality and our deepest desires and what we would do if we could live forever. It's an intoxicating thought. It's an intoxicating genre that is continuously evolving in very, very clever ways. And I just think it's such a bummer that Stoker never got to live to see the incredible beast he created, this vampire culture that has changed all of our lives. So to the overwhelming majority of you guys that voted for Dracula, Thank you. And if you guys want to be part of our voting process, go ahead and follow me on Instagram, because don't you want to have a say in what we talk about? Until next time, guys. Chin chin. Hey creeps, it's me again. I just wanted to pop on really quick to let you guys know that this Saturday, the 24th, I am hosting a virtual Halloween party. I am so excited to be doing this. So basically, I'll be making up spook tales, telling creepy stories for an entire hour. You can chat with me. And then together, we are going to watch a live ghost hunting investigation with two of the guys from Ghost Hunters. It's going to be so freaking fun. So if you want to join me, have a little bit of Halloween spirit, follow the link below and get your tickets. See you there.